A scream cut through the stone courtyard of Hawthorne Hill the moment the woman stepped past the wrought iron gate. It wasn't the panicked scream of someone in danger. It was the sharp, offended gasp of a matriarch whose world had just tilted. Eleanor Hawthorne froze mid-stride on the terrace steps, her gloved hand tightening around a champagne flute as though the glass itself had betrayed her. The string quartet faltered. Conversation stuttered. Heads turned toward the tall, composed woman in the navy wool coat who stood at the edge of the wedding crowd with the quiet certainty of someone who had every right to be there. But no one recognized her name on the guest list, and in circles like this, that alone was enough to ignite suspicion like dry tinder. Grace Sullivan felt the weight of their stares the way a person feels heat from a fire before the flames touch skin. Her breath left her in a controlled exhale, soft enough that only she heard it. She had not come to start trouble, but now trouble was walking straight toward her in heels that clicked like accusations on the flagstone path. Eleanor descended the steps with the rigid poise of a woman who had held her community in a tight fist for decades. Her pearl necklace barely trembled, but her voice carried the same cold snap as the Hudson River in deep winter. "You. Stop right there." The guests closest to her stepped back, as if clearing space for a ritual. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Grace did not move. Her posture was steady, shoulders relaxed, chin slightly lifted. She had spent a lifetime controlling the tremors of anger that once rose quickly in her chest as a young girl standing in this very courtyard. That girl had learned silence. The woman she had become knew better. Eleanor's eyes swept over Grace with the precision of someone appraising a counterfeit. "This is a private event," she said. "A very private event. Our staff must have made a mistake." The last word landed hard, as if the mistake were not the system, but the woman standing before her. Behind Eleanor, a few guests nodded in self-satisfied agreement. Others watched with the slack-jawed intrigue of people who craved drama only when they felt safe from it. Grace held her gaze. "I received an invitation." Eleanor laughed once, a brittle sound that cracked like old china. "We do not send invitations to strangers." She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The frost in her tone did the work. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, but most clung to the performance. People like them didn't question Eleanor Hawthorne. They followed the current she created. A man in his 70s, face pink from wine and righteousness, leaned toward his wife. "She probably wandered in from the road," he muttered, not softly enough. "These people always think they can slip into places meant for better company." His wife elbowed him, but not to disagree, only to hush. Grace heard every word. A younger staff member, a server carrying a tray of sparkling cider, stopped mid-stride when she saw Grace. Her eyes widened with something dangerously close to recognition. The glass on her tray rattled. She quickly lowered her gaze and moved away before Eleanor noticed. Eleanor stepped closer, her perfume leaving a faint trail of lavender and old money. "Who sent you that invitation?" she demanded. "Tell me the name." "Now." Grace reached into her coat pocket. The crowd tensed, a ridiculous overreaction, born from too much imagination and too little exposure to real life. What she pulled out, however, was not a threat, only a simple cream-colored envelope, embossed with the Hawthorne crest, a crest that once hung above the fireplace in her childhood bedroom on the north side of the property. She held it out. "Your family did." Eleanor didn't touch the envelope. Her eyes narrowed at the crest, as if it might shift into something else under scrutiny. "Impossible. Show me the card." Her voice softened, but it was the softness of velvet wrapped around steel. Grace opened the envelope and withdrew the invitation. The name printed in dark ink was clear: Dr. Grace Sullivan. A murmur drifted through the crowd. Some guests craned their necks to see. Others whispered, connecting dots they didn't fully understand, but were suddenly eager to sketch. Eleanor scanned the card, her jaw tightening until the skin around her mouth paled. "This is a mistake," she said, crisp and controlled. "An administrative oversight. My son's firm must have sent the wrong card. Our event planner will correct it." She gestured sharply toward a young woman near the catering tent, who flinched as though struck. Grace slid the invitation back into its envelope. "I see." Eleanor mistook the calm response for acquiescence. "Good. Then we'll have security escort you to the front gate while we sort this out. You understand it's not personal. We simply cannot allow unknown individuals to mingle at a family event." Unknown. The word echoed through Grace's ribs like a hollow bell. Before she could respond, a voice cut across the garden, something low, startled, and unguarded. "My God, Grace Sullivan." The speaker was Harold Green, the estate's longest-serving groundskeeper, a man whose hands carried the imprint of every stone and tree on this land. He stood a few yards away, a bundle of linens tucked under one arm. His weathered face had gone pale. Eleanor snapped toward him. "Harold, do you know this woman?" Harold swallowed his Adam's apple jerking like a man caught between truth and consequence. Well, I knew someone by that name. A long time ago." His gaze drifted to Grace, and something old and aching flickered between them. "She looks just like Eleanor," cut him off. Enough. The sharpness in her tone made the guests straighten. She addressed the crowd loudly enough to reclaim control. Sometimes people from the past get confused about boundaries. It happens with properties as old as this one. She turned back to Grace. "You've had your moment, dear. Now it's time to go." Guests nodded, reassured by Eleanor's poised authority. But beneath the surface, tension hummed a faint static rising across the garden like the warning before a storm. Grace felt it ripple through her spine. She could hear her own heartbeat now, steady but growing louder. She took one small step forward. The movement was calm, deliberate. Eleanor stiffened. The crowd leaned in. Grace's voice came out low, carried by a quiet certainty that unsettled even those who didn't understand it. "I'm not confused, Mrs. Hawthorne." A hush fell. Even the quartet stopped pretending to tune their instruments. "For people like you," she continued, "history is something preserved on plaques and mantles." Her eyes lifted to the windows of the manor, glowing with afternoon light. "For people like me, history is something we survived." Gasps fluttered through the air. Eleanor's breath hitched. "What exactly are you implying?" Grace didn't answer her directly. Her gaze drifted toward the third-floor window on the east wing, the room with faded, rose-patterned drapes, the room she once stared out of, as a child imagining a future no one else believed she'd reach. Her voice softened almost to herself. "I haven't stood on this land in over 3 decades. Harold's eyes burned with recognition. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her, but couldn't yet name the reason. She straightened her shoulders and summoned the brittle authority that had carried her through every charity gala and board meeting for 30 years. "Whatever you think this place is to you, it's time to let it go. Security will walk you out." 2 guards began moving toward Grace, but she didn't budge. Instead, she reached into her coat once more, not hastily, but with the quiet resolve of someone who knew exactly what would come next. The crowd held its breath, suspended on the thin, trembling line between assumption and a revelation. The guard slowed. Eleanor's voice cracked. "What are you doing?" Grace pulled out a small leather card holder. Inside it lay something no one expected to see at a wedding reception in the middle of Hudson Valley. Something that once revealed would pull the ground out from under everyone's feet. Her fingers paused on its edge. Her heartbeat steadied. Then she lifted her eyes to Eleanor Hawthorne, whose world was about to lose all its certainty. "Before you send anyone to remove me," Grace said softly, "you should know exactly who you're asking them to remove." She drew the card from its case, and the garden fell silent enough to hear the breath of the river wind sweeping through the bare November trees. Grace Sullivan stepped forward, and every assumption in the courtyard began to crumble. The card in Grace's hand caught the afternoon light, a flicker of authority that moved across the garden like a blade. Lieutenant Mark Ellison saw it first. He wasn't standing close, but years in law enforcement had sharpened his eyes to details others missed. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, as if something inside him clicked into place. The chatter around him dissolved. He took 2 deliberate steps forward, boots grinding softly against the gravel path, but he kept his distance watching. Eleanor Hawthorne didn't notice. Her gaze was locked on Grace's face, searching for cracks, flaws, anything that would restore the hierarchy she had relied on for decades. But Grace's expression remained calm, too calm, and that steadiness unnerved Eleanor more than any raised voice ever could. "What is that supposed to be?" Eleanor demanded, her voice sharp but wavering at the edges. Grace didn't answer. She held the card between 2 fingers, letting the silence draw out until the weight of it pressed into every guest's chest. Only then did she turn the card outward. A murmur rippled across the garden, low and uncertain, a breath caught before understanding fully formed. Mark exhaled slowly. He knew the insignia. Every officer did. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. She leaned in, slightly squinting at the emblem embossed in silver. Then her face drained of color, not because she understood, but because she realized she didn't. "I suggest," Grace said evenly, "that you stop assuming who I am." The guards hesitated, their steps faltering. One cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we should call this in." Eleanor whipped toward him. "Call what in? She's trespassing. That's all this is." But the guard wasn't looking at Eleanor anymore. He was staring at the card, a small rectangle that suddenly carried the weight of something far larger than a wedding dispute. He stepped back, without meaning to instinct, folding into self-preservation. Grace lowered her hand, sliding the card back into its holder with a smooth, practiced motion. "I did not come here to disrupt your son's wedding," she said. "I came because I received an invitation," and because her gaze drifted toward the manor again, the windows that reflected pieces of a childhood lost. "Because this place is woven into my life in ways you cannot begin to imagine." A breeze swept through the courtyard, catching the hem of Grace's coat and stirring the fallen leaves around her boots. The guests shivered, though the air wasn't cold. At the edge of the tent, Evan Blake, the young attorney who handled the Hawthorne family's corporate affairs, pushed through the crowd with a look that bordered on panic. His tie was askew, and his tablet blinked with incoming notifications. He stopped short when he saw Grace's confusion overtaking his features. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said breathlessly. "We may have an issue." Eleanor whipped around. "What issue? This woman does not belong here." Evan hesitated, his jaw working, as he searched for the least explosive wording. "There was an error," he said finally. "A clerical one. The invitation was not meant for her, but it was sent through our automated system using old contact lists. I'm still sorting out how her information ended up in the database. Guests murmured, leaning in the scent of perfume and nerves thickening in the air. Eleanor seized the explanation like a lifeline. You see, she said, facing Grace with renewed force, a mistake, a simple mix-up. Grace's expression didn't change. Evan swallowed hard. There's more. He glanced nervously at Mark Ellison, who gave him a single subtle nod, urging him to continue. When I looked up her name, Grace Sullivan, he inhaled sharply. There are sealed records associated with Hawthorne Hill, records I wasn't aware existed. Eleanor's breath halted. What records? Evan shook his head. I don't know yet. But something's been redacted from our title history. Something from decades ago. The crowd stiffened, as if the earth itself had shifted beneath them. Eleanor laughed again, but this time there was no conviction behind it. Redacted records. That's absurd. We bought this property legally. We have the deed. Do you? Grace asked gently. For a moment, everything stopped. Eleanor recoiled as if struck. Of course we do. This estate has been in our family for 20 years. Grace's eyes softened, a flicker of something mournful passing through them. I know exactly how long. Evan moved closer to Eleanor and lowered his voice, but not enough. If there are sealed documents, someone requested them. And that someone isn't us. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her champagne flute until the stem threatened to snap. Mark finally stepped forward, addressing Grace with a respectful nod. Ma'am, if there is an issue with the property records, I need to know whether you intend to file a formal complaint. Grace met his gaze, steady and unreadable. Not today. The guests exhaled relieved without understanding why, but Grace continued. I will not be escorted out of a place that still carries my name, even if it has been hidden behind layers of paperwork. Eleanor froze. Your name? What are you talking about? Before Grace could answer, Harold Green stepped into the circle forming around them. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice held a quiet courage that surprised even him. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said softly, there's something you should know. Eleanor spun toward him. Not now, Harold. But he didn't retreat. His gaze stayed fixed on Grace, memory sharpening his tone. When I was a young man, I worked for her father. This land, it was theirs long before your family ever arrived. A shockwave tore through the guests. Eleanor's face reddened. Harold, that is enough. You're confused and you're embarrassing yourself. Harold shook his head. I remember her. The little girl who used to run through the orchard on summer evenings. The Sullivan child. His voice cracked. She disappeared after the dispute. The one no one talked about. Evan's head snapped up. What dispute? Eleanor's eyes flashed with warning, but the truth was no longer hers to contain. Grace inhaled slowly, allowing the past to settle in her lungs like cold air. The dispute that forced my mother to pack whatever she could carry in one night. The dispute that ended with a handwritten letter slipped under our door telling us we no longer belonged here. Mark's face darkened. A handwritten letter is not a legal notice. I was a child, Grace replied. I didn't know the difference. Evan tapped rapidly on his tablet, brow furrowing deeper with each new screen he opened. Mrs. Hawthorne, there's something inconsistent here. The earliest file attached to the property is from a different trustee than the one listed when your family purchased it. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice trembling. Are you accusing my husband of foul play now? Evan said quietly, but it appears someone else might have manipulated the chain of custody before the sale ever took place. Silence choked the courtyard. The string quartet set down their instruments. A gust brushed through the skeletal maple branches, scattering leaves across the stone steps like fallen secrets. Grace took a small step forward. I didn't return to disrupt your event, but I won't be erased again. Not from this land. Not from my own history. Eleanor steadied herself on the back of a chair, fighting the tremor spreading through her limbs. She looked at Grace, as though seeing her for the first time, not as an intruder, but as a ghost from a past she never bothered to understand. "What do you want?" she whispered. Grace's answer came softly, but it cut clean. "The truth. All of it." Evan swallowed. "Mrs. Hawthorne, we need to access the sealed documents. If Ms. Sullivan has standing, she may be entitled to." "We are not opening anything." Eleanor snapped, fear sharpening into anger, but Mark spoke. Before she could continue, his voice controlled and firm. "If there's a question about rightful ownership, it isn't optional." Eleanor looked around, searching for someone, anyone, to save her from the sudden unraveling. No one moved. Then from the far edge of the crowd, Andrew Hawthorne emerged. He had been inside with the wedding party, unaware of the storm forming outside. His tuxedo jacket hung open, and he still held the champagne glass from the rehearsal toast. When he saw Grace, something flickered across his face, recognition followed by disbelief. He walked forward slowly, as if approaching a truth he had once glimpsed, but never named. "Grace Sullivan," he said, quietly. "I know that name." The garden tightened again. Grace met his eyes but did not speak. Andrew swallowed hard. "I met you years ago, at the courthouse. You weren't a judge then, but—" He shook his head, stunned. "What are you doing here?" Grace held his gaze with a gentle gravity. "Trying at last to understand what was taken from me." Andrew's hand trembled. The champagne glass tilted. He didn't notice. "Mom," he said, turning toward Eleanor. "What did you do?" Her breath caught. "Andrew." But she never finished the sentence, because for the first time all afternoon, her son looked at her, as though she were not the victim of an intrusion, but the source of a secret that had just stepped back into the light. Andrew's question hung in the cold November air, heavier than any accusation Eleanor had faced in her well-manicured life. Her breath shook the first visible crack in a woman known for iron composure. Guests shifted uneasy. The silence felt dangerous, like standing on a frozen lake and hearing something deep beneath the ice begin to break. Grace did not move. She watched Eleanor with a stillness that carried decades of unspoken history, as if she already knew the answer Eleanor feared to say aloud. Evan Blake's tablet chimed again, a soft, insistent reminder that the digital world had its own truths to reveal. He glanced down, eyes widening, then quickly pressed the screen to silence it. His thumbs twitched nervously against the device, unconsciously scrolling through files he did not yet have the courage to show. Mark Ellison stepped closer, positioning himself at the edge of the gathering, like someone preparing to stabilize a building before it collapsed. His hand hovered near his belt, not on his weapon, but on his radio, ready for a different kind of emergency. Eleanor finally forced herself to look at her son. "Andrew," she said, voice thin, but trying to sound firm. "There is nothing here that concerns you." "That's not true," he replied quietly. "This is my home, my wedding. And you look terrified." Eleanor opened her mouth, but no words came. Her eyes darted between Andrew and Grace, caught between the family she built and the past she tried to bury. Harold Green cleared his throat gently. "Sir, your mother doesn't know everything that happened back then." Eleanor spun toward him, fear turning sharp. "Harold, do not your husband handled the sale," Harold said softly. He was the one who dealt with the agent, not Mrs. Hawthorne. Andrew's expression darkened with dawning confusion. "Handled the sale? What sale?" Evan finally stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "Andrew, that's the issue. The sale shouldn't have gone through at all." He lifted the tablet. There were irregularities in the title transfer. Big ones. Eleanor shook her head violently. "Stop this. You don't understand the legal landscape at the time. My husband did everything by the book." Grace's eyes flickered with something like sympathy, but it wasn't directed at Eleanor. It was for the younger version of herself, who once believed the world would protect her because the truth was on her side. "Did he?" she asked softly. Eleanor bristled. "You have no idea what my husband endured. He was trying to rescue this estate from financial ruin." Grace tilted her head. "Whose financial ruin?" Eleanor blinked, as if slapped by a question she had never allowed herself to consider. Andrew took a step toward Grace. "What exactly did your family lose?" Grace's breath tightened in her chest. She hadn't intended to reveal everything, not this soon, not in front of strangers draped in silk and entitlement. But she felt the moment shift beneath her feet. This was no longer about confrontation. It was about finally speaking something she had carried alone for too long. "My father believed in the integrity of the system," she began. The breeze lifted a strand of her hair, brushing it across her cheek like a familiar ghost. He thought that paperwork signatures and proper filings were enough to protect what generations before him had built. He kept every document in perfect order. He trusted the process. Her gaze traveled across the courtyard to the tall hedges lining the orchard path. In her memory, the branches were full of summer light, not stripped bare by winter. But one night, she continued, a letter arrived. No legal seal. No official signature. My mother was told it was a warning, not a final notice. She swallowed. They left anyway. She thought she was protecting me. Eleanor's lips parted in disbelief. That's not possible. Notices can't be delivered like that. Something must have been misunderstood. Mark Ellison stepped in quietly. "Ma'am, it's entirely possible someone exploited the family's trust. It happens more often than people realize." Evan nodded grimly. "Especially when the property in question is worth millions." Eleanor shot him a look of betrayal. "Are you implying that my husband—" "No," Evan said quickly. "But I'm saying someone manipulated the chain of custody before you ever saw a contract." Grace inhaled deeply, letting the truth settle. "My father tried to fight it, but he didn't have the resources your family did. And by the time he gathered enough evidence to challenge the claim, her voice faltered. He was gone. The murmur that rippled through the crowd now carried something new shame." Andrew lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never knew." Eleanor looked as though the ground beneath her had vanished. For the first time since Grace arrived, Eleanor's anger drained, leaving only confusion, and beneath that, a fear she could no longer disguise. "If what you're saying is true," she said quietly, "why wait until now?" "Because I didn't know until now." Grace replied. "I didn't know that the sealed records were tied to this estate. I didn't know that the letter my mother trusted was forged, and I didn't know," her voice softened, "that I would be invited back here." A long silence followed. Then Andrew's fiancée, Emily Carter, stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. Until now she had remained, half hidden, a graceful silhouette in satin, her eyes filled with the quiet intelligence of someone who listens before she speaks. She looked directly at Eleanor. Mrs. Hawthorne, if there's even a chance that what Dr. Sullivan is saying is true, don't you want to know? Don't you want to make it right?" Eleanor flinched as if struck. She glanced at Emily, the woman who would soon carry her family's name, not with anger, but with a weary kind of realization. Emily's words carried no accusation, only earnestness, and that made them harder to dismiss. Evan cleared his throat again, a tremor in his voice. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I can request access to the sealed documents. With Ms. Sullivan's consent, we can petition for release. It won't be immediate, but it will tell us the truth." Eleanor steadied herself against a nearby chair. For once, she didn't reach for dominance. She reached for balance. "Grace," she said quietly, "if mistakes were made, they weren't mine." Grace nodded slowly. "I believe that." Andrew turned to his mother. "So what do we do?" Before Eleanor could answer, the double doors of the manor swung open sharply. Every head snapped toward the entrance. A tall man in a charcoal suit stepped out, shoulders tense, face flushed from hurried movement. Eleanor's breath caught. It was her brother-in-law Thomas Hawthorne, the man who had handled all legal matters after her husband's passing 15 years ago. He wasn't supposed to be here today. He had declined the wedding invitation, claiming business obligations out of state. But now here he was, jaw set, eyes locked on Grace, with an expression that was not confusion, but recognition, deep, unmistakable recognition. And fear. Evan stiffened. Mr. Hawthorne Thomas didn't acknowledge him. His focus remained fixed on Grace, the color draining from his face. "What are you doing here?" he asked, voice low and tight. Grace did not blink. "The same question I've been asking." Eleanor looked between them, bewildered. "Thomas, do you know her?" Thomas swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat working. "Yes, I know exactly who she is." The garden froze again. Harold whispered, "Lord help us." Andrew stepped forward. "Uncle Thomas, what is going on?" Thomas didn't answer him. Instead, he turned to Eleanor, voice trembling with something that sounded like defeat. "She shouldn't have come back. Not now." Grace's voice sliced through the air with quiet clarity. "I didn't come looking for you, Thomas. But maybe now it's time you tell them what you did." Eleanor staggered back, one hand gripping the railing as if the world had suddenly tilted beneath her feet. Thomas Hawthorne closed his eyes for a long moment, as though preparing himself for something irreversible. When he opened them, the truth was already there, burning on his tongue. And the wedding guests of Hawthorne Hill realized that the past hadn't returned by accident. It had come to collect. Thomas Hawthorne stood at the top of the stone steps, like a man staring down the gallows he'd built with his own hands. His breath came fast, shallow, barely warming the cold November air. For years his voice had carried authority at board meetings, fundraisers, and town councils. But now, when he finally spoke, it came out ragged, stripped of its practiced certainty. "This isn't the place," he said, eyes fixed on Grace. "Not here. Not like this." Grace's voice was level, steady. "Then you should have considered that before you put a child out of her home." The words struck him harder than any slap. Eleanor gasped softly, as though she herself had been struck. Andrew stepped closer to his uncle, seeking answers, but Thomas didn't look at him. He couldn't. Guests clustered near the terrace railings, forming quiet rings of observers drawn by gravity they didn't understand. Emily slipped her hand into Andrew's, feeling the tremor running through him. Down the path, Mark Ellison stood, like a shadow, waiting for the truth to pass through him. Thomas dragged a palm across his face, as though trying to wipe himself into a different man. "You don't know what you're talking about." Grace's eyes did not soften. "I know exactly what I'm talking about." "You were there the night the letter was delivered?" Eleanor turned sharply. "Thomas, what letter?" He closed his eyes. The truth pressed against the back of his teeth, a tide he could no longer hold. Harold Green, who had remained silent for several long minutes, spoke in a voice so fragile it shook. "Mrs. Hawthorne, that letter wasn't from any court. It wasn't from any bank, either." Eleanor stared at him. "Harold, what do you mean?" "My husband said—" "Your husband never saw it," Harold said gently. "He was out of town. Mr. Thomas handled everything that a month." The ground shifted beneath Eleanor's feet. She looked at Thomas again, harder this time. "Tell me," she whispered. "Tell me you didn't do something that would ruin us." Thomas laughed, once a broken, humorless sound. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted any of this?" He turned abruptly, pacing toward the balustrade, overlooking the orchard. His hands gripped the cold stone as if grounding himself. The estate was drowning. The lawsuits, the taxes, the maintenance your husband refused to sell. He said Hawthorne Hill was the family's legacy, even if it bankrupted him. Eleanor whispered, "It was our legacy." Thomas continued as if he hadn't heard. "I looked for buyers. No one wanted a property wrapped in unresolved disputes. The Sullivan claim made banks nervous. Your husband was sick at the time. You didn't know the half of what we were dealing with." Grace spoke quietly, forcing him to face her. "So you created a crisis where none existed. You drove us out so the estate could be obtained cheaply." Thomas flinched. "I didn't drive you out. I just let things play out. The letter was supposed to scare your mother into negotiating, not fleeing. I planned to buy the estate for a fraction, clear the title, then transfer it to the Hawthorne family. We would have saved everything." Grace's voice cooled, no louder than before, but sharp enough to still the air. "You gambled with a family's home. My home." Thomas turned back toward her, desperation pulling at his features. "Your family was already thinking of selling. The orchard was failing. Your father had medical bills. I thought I was offering a lifeline." "You offered a lie," she said. He winced. "I never meant for it to get out of hand. When your family left overnight, the whole plan fell apart. Your father tried to contest the sale later, but the paperwork," his voice broke. "The paperwork had already been sealed. I couldn't undo it." Mark Ellison stepped forward. Sealed by who? Thomas hesitated. "A trustee. Someone who owed me a favor." Evan Blake nearly dropped his tablet. "You tampered with chain of custody, Thomas. That's not a clerical issue. That's a federal offense." Eleanor stared at her brother-in-law as though seeing him for the first time. "You forged a path to this house. You put us all at risk. Do you understand that Thomas looked smaller than he ever had in his tailored suit?" "I did it for the family." "No," Eleanor said, anger finally surfacing beneath the shock. "You did it for control. You did it because you couldn't stand the thought of this estate leaving the Hawthorne name." Grace watched him closely. For years she had imagined this moment, imagined how it might feel to see the man responsible for unraveling her childhood confronted with the truth. But standing here in the shadow of the house she once called home, she felt something unexpected, not triumph, but a profound ache. Andrew stepped toward Thomas, voice trembling with disbelief. "You destroyed someone's life so we could have a prettier address." Thomas's mouth opened, but no words came. Emily tugged Andrew gently, eyes full of sympathy for Grace. "Sometimes we inherit more than we bargained for," she murmured. Evan looked between them, all the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. Mrs. Hawthorne, if these allegations are true, the law requires we notify the county registrar immediately, and likely the district attorney. Eleanor's eyes glistened. We could lose everything. Grace lifted her chin. You won't lose everything. You'll lose the illusion that this estate was untouched by wrongdoing. Thomas bristled, a flash of anger returning to his voice. You think you can judge me? You weren't here. You have no idea what it was like. Grace didn't let him finish. I know exactly what it was like. I packed my life into 2 trash bags because of your choices, and I buried my father believing he failed us when you were the one who tipped the scales. Thomas's breath hitched. The truth, spoken aloud, finally found its mark. Mark Ellison stepped closer, voice steady. Mr. Hawthorne, I'm going to need your cooperation moving forward. This isn't something we can brush aside. Eleanor pressed a hand to her forehead. This was supposed to be a celebration. My son's wedding. And now Grace's expression softened just slightly. I didn't come to ruin your day. Thomas scoffed. Then why show up at all? Grace looked toward the manor again, her eyes lingering on the 3rd-floor window with the faded memories behind it. Because someone invited me. And maybe deep down, this house wanted me back. A hush fell again, uneasy, electric. Evan stepped forward carefully. Grace, if you're willing, we could review the sealed documents together. Privately, before this goes any further. Thomas shook his head sharply. No, absolutely not. If she opens those records, everything unravels. Grace turned to him, and something inside her, something long dormant, rose to the surface. Thomas, she said softly. It already has. Eleanor let out a choked breath. Andrew slipped an arm around her shoulders, guiding her gently back toward a nearby chair. For the first time in her life, she looked like a woman who didn't know how to stand on her own. Thomas backed away, shaking his head, eyes darting for an exit that didn't exist. Grace Andrew said quietly, "What happens now?" She looked at him, really looked, and saw a man caught between legacy and conscience. "That depends," she said, "on whether your family wants the truth or the comfort of pretending none of this happened." The wind swept across the courtyard once more, carrying the brittle sound of a branch snapping in the orchard below. And somewhere deep inside Hawthorne Hill, a door that had been closed for decades began to stir. Thomas lurched down the steps, as if the air itself had turned hostile. His polished shoes scraped against the stone, slipping once before he caught himself on the railing. Eyes followed him. Guests, staff, family, all carrying the same stunned recognition that the man they trusted had just revealed a fracture none of them saw coming. He looked for a path out, but there was none. Truth had a way of closing every door behind it. Grace watched him move across the courtyard, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet, mournful clarity. She had once imagined confronting the man responsible for uprooting her life. She had pictured anger, triumph, justice served on a silver platter. But standing here, she felt no victory in his unraveling. Only the weight of the years that had been lost, the echoes of a future her family never got to live. Mark Ellison's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said firmly, "I need you to stay where I can see you." Thomas froze mid-stride. His shoulders rose and fell, the breath beneath them, sharp and visible in the cold afternoon air. "You're not arresting me." "There's no charge," he snapped, though his voice trembled. "Not yet," Mark replied calmly. "But given what you've admitted, I can't let you leave the premises." Evan Blake stepped closer, tablet tucked against his chest like a shield. "Thomas, we need to talk." Whatever happened back then, we need a clear record. You could face real consequences. Thomas turned to him, slowly, eyes narrow and raw. Is that all any of you care about? Consequences, penalties? The law. His voice cracked on the last word, revealing something brittle underneath. I was trying to save this family. Eleanor flinched, gripping the arm of her chair. Her earlier fury had cooled into something far more fragile, fear, confusion, and the beginnings of grief. Save us from what she whispered. Thomas looked at her, and something inside him seemed to break from losing everything. Your husband was drowning in debt. Hawthorne Hill was slipping away. I did what I had to do. You created a lie, Eleanor replied softly, and you built our life on top of it. Emily stepped in, her voice gentle but unwavering. Mr. Hawthorne saving a family doesn't require destroying another. Thomas blinked at her, as though startled that someone so young could see through him so easily. Andrew stood rigid, jaw clenched, his hand still linked with Emily's. Why didn't you tell us, he asked. Why hide it for so long? Thomas's expression twisted with something between pride and shame. Because once your father died, I was the only one who knew how close this estate was to ruin. I thought if I could stabilize things, if I could keep the past buried long enough, the rest would work itself out. Grace stepped forward. The past doesn't bury itself, Thomas. It waits. Her words landed with the force of truth, spoken too late. He bristled, turning sharply toward her. You don't know what I carried, what I sacrificed. I took on debts your father couldn't pay. I cleaned up a mess no one else could manage. Grace met his anger with a steady gaze. And who cleaned up mine? Who cleaned up the pieces of a childhood ripped apart by fear, by confusion, by a letter meant to intimidate, not inform? The courtyard fell silent. Thomas's hand rose to his forehead, as though the memory pounded there. I didn't think she would run, he whispered. I didn't think she would disappear with you in the middle of the night. Because you didn't think of her at all, Grace said. You didn't think of me. Harold Green stepped forward with a trembling breath. Mr. Hawthorne, your brother, would have never allowed this. He loved this land, but he never would have taken it from a child. Thomas flinched as if stabbed. Don't bring him into this, he snapped. You didn't see him at the end. Eleanor rose from her chair, her posture straight yet unsteady. Thomas, she said, voice sharp as broken glass, stop deflecting. This isn't about my husband. This is about you. Her brother-in-law stared at her, stunned. Eleanor Hawthorne, the eternal diplomat, had stepped firmly onto the side of truth. It hadn't happened in years, not like this. Grace exhaled softly. She could see the shift happening, the long-buried truth seeping into the cracks of the Hawthorne family, like a tide they could no longer hold back. Evan cleared his throat, speaking carefully. Mrs. Hawthorne, if we're going to move forward, we need full access to all property records, including any documents signed by your late husband or Mr. Hawthorne. He paused. Especially sealed ones. Eleanor's face tightened. I'll cooperate. Whatever it takes. Thomas stared at her with disbelief. You can't be serious. You're siding with her. I'm siding with honesty, Eleanor said. For once I'm choosing what's right over what looks right. Andrew took a step closer to Grace. If what Thomas did was illegal, if you were wronged, I want to help make it right. Grace nodded, once, appreciating the sincerity in his voice. But Thomas wasn't finished. His breath hitched fury, rising to drown the shame he could no longer bear. You're all fools, he snarled. You think she's here for the truth. You think she cares about justice." Grace held his gaze. "Why do you think I'm here, Thomas?" His voice rose, shaking. "Because you want the estate? You want the land? You want revenge?" "No," she said quietly. "I want acknowledgement." Thomas barked a hollow laugh. "And then what? You take us to court. You drag this family through the mud. You destroy everything we've built. What you built on deceit was never yours," Grace replied. The courtyard erupted into whispers. Mark raised a hand, steady and firm. "That's enough." He approached Thomas slowly. "Sir, I need you to sit with me until we sort this out." Thomas backed away again. No, I'm not letting this happen. I won't let her take the only thing this family has left." "But it was never yours to give, Grace," said exhaustion in her voice, "or to keep." Emily stepped closer to Grace. "What do you want to do next, Grace?" Looked around the guests, holding their breath. Evan clutching his tablet like a lifeline. Mark poised to intervene Andrew, struggling with the betrayal unraveling in his family. Eleanor's proud posture slowly collapsing under truth's weight. Her answer came from a place deeper than anger, deeper even than grief. "I want to see the documents," she said. "No secrets. No more shadows." Thomas's chest heaved. "You don't understand," he whispered. "You open those files and the whole town will know what happened. The board, the donors, the partners, they'll all turn on us. Then they'll finally see who built their legacy," Grace answered. "And who stole it?" Eleanor turned to her brother-in-law, voice low with quiet devastation. "Thomas, if there is something in those records, anything, we need to face it." He looked at her with a flicker of desperation, as if begging her to choose denial over truth. She didn't. Defeat broke across his face like a wave. Mark stepped beside him. "Sir, sit down." Thomas didn't fight. His legs buckled slightly as he lowered himself onto a bench, staring at the ground, as though it held the past he'd run from for decades. Evan tapped quickly on his tablet. "I'll file the request. It'll take some time, but once the judge approves unsealing." He trailed off, glancing at Grace. Grace looked toward the manor once more, the windows reflecting a life that might have been. "I'll wait," she said softly. "I've been waiting for 30 years." The wind moved through the orchard again, bending the bare branches, like bowed heads bearing witness. And for the first time since she stepped foot on Hawthorne Hill, Grace Sullivan felt the house listening. A restless murmur surged across the courtyard as the weight of Grace's final words settled over Hawthorne Hill. The guests who had arrived expecting violin music and champagne toasts now found themselves trapped inside the unraveling of a family's concealed history. A cloud passed over the sun, dimming the gold afternoon light and casting sharp shadows across the stone path. It felt as though the estate itself were bracing for something long overdue. Grace exhaled, slowly steadying herself. The decision to unseal the documents should have brought relief. Instead, it awakened a hollow ache. She hadn't expected a fear that the truth she sought might hurt even more than the lie that stole her home. She folded her arms tightly across her chest, as if trying to preserve warmth that had slipped away decades ago. Across from her, Eleanor Hawthorne sank deeper into the garden chair, staring at a spot on the ground as though it might rewrite the past. Her hands, usually so controlled, trembled lightly in her lap. The petals of a fallen chrysanthemum clung to the hem of her coat. For a moment, she seemed smaller than her reputation, smaller than her influence, a woman confronting the limits of her own certainty. Andrew moved to her side. "Mom," he said gently, touching her shoulder. Whatever comes next, we face it together. She looked up at him with tired eyes. I don't know if I can survive what comes next, she whispered. Everything I thought we built. What if it wasn't ours at all? Emily knelt beside her future mother-in-law hands, clasped over Eleanor's. Owning the property isn't the same as belonging to it. What matters is how you choose to stand now that you know the truth. Eleanor blinked, as though hearing a language she hadn't spoken in years, one rooted not in pride or tradition, but humility. Mark Ellison approached them, the gravel crunching softly beneath his boots. Mrs. Hawthorne, just so you're aware, this is not a criminal proceeding yet. Not unless the sealed documents reveal intentional fraud that involved current members of your household. Eleanor's voice cracked. You're telling me my family might walk away untouched while my brother-in-law bears it alone? Grace watched her carefully. Truth doesn't always punish the guilty in equal measure. Sometimes the punishment is simply knowing what you allowed to happen under your name. Eleanor flinched. Thomas Hawthorne sat on the bench nearby, elbows on his knees, head bowed like a man awaiting judgment. His hands knotted tightly white at the knuckles. Every so often his gaze flicked toward Grace, pleading silently for something she could not give absolution. Evan Blake returned from the manor with a thin folder in hand. He looked shaken, his jaw tense. I accessed the preliminary inventory of sealed files, he said. The full documents require a judge's order, but the index alone is troubling. He hesitated. It lists 3 sealed affidavits and something marked as Exhibit C, a handwritten note submitted as evidence during the Sullivan dispute. Mark nodded. Good. That means a record exists. We're not dealing with phantom documents. Eleanor's brows knitted. What does that mean? It means, Evan answered softly, someone filed testimony and evidence regarding the estate's transfer. Someone knew the situation wasn't clean. Grace closed her eyes. Her mother's voice echoed faintly in her memory, brittle with exhaustion, the night they left. We can't fight this baby. We don't have the strength. She wondered now if her mother had been protecting her from a truth even more painful than displacement. Mark turned to Grace. Once the petition is filed, the court will act. I can assure you of that. Grace nodded. For the first time all afternoon, her shoulders relaxed a fraction, but the quiet peace was short-lived. Thomas rose abruptly from the bench, voice hoarse. You're all acting like I'm some villain in a cheap novel, but you don't understand what this estate meant to your father. His gaze bore into Eleanor. He believed Hawthorne Hill was the last thing holding the family together. He begged me to do whatever it took to protect it. Eleanor's breath hitched. My husband never would have asked you to commit fraud. Thomas hesitated only a moment long enough to answer her without speaking. Yes, he would have if the alternative were humiliation. But aloud, he said, he asked me to save the estate. The rest I chose. Grace studied him carefully. So you admit the deception was yours? His shoulders slumped. Yes. The confession struck the courtyard with a heavy, resonant hush. Andrew stepped forward, eyes blazing with something deeper than anger, disillusionment. You let us believe we inherited something honorable. You let me grow up thinking this land held our family history. But it wasn't ours. It never was. It became yours when you loved it, Thomas shot back. The moment you played in the orchard. The moment your mother planted the rose garden. The moment your father don't, Andrew said sharply, don't use his name to justify what you stole. Thomas swallowed hard, wounded, yet defiant. He took a step toward Grace, but Mark instinctively shifted between them, a silent barrier. Thomas's gaze flicked briefly to the lieutenant, before returning to Grace. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "An apology, I will give you one. Restitution. Fine. But taking the estate now, destroying this family, what good will that do you?" Grace held his gaze without blinking. "You think I came here for the house?" She gestured toward the manor, its stone walls catching the fading light. "A home is more than land and lumber. You erased a legacy that belonged to my family. You buried it beneath your ambition. And you let a child believe her father had failed her." Thomas's face crumpled just slightly, as if her words had found the last unbroken part of him. Evan cleared his throat again quietly. "Grace, legally speaking, even if fraud is proven, it doesn't guarantee you regain ownership. It depends on the nature of the transfer statutes of limitation and whether the court finds ongoing harm." "I know," she said. Eleanor looked up sharply. "You know," Grace turned to her, "I'm not here to take back Hawthorne Hill by force. I'm here to reclaim the truth of what happened, to restore what was stolen from my family's name." Eleanor studied her for a long, searching moment. For the first time, she saw not an intruder or a threat, but a woman carrying a grief she herself could not imagine. "And what if the truth changes everything?" Eleanor asked. Grace's reply was quiet, but unwavering. Then everything needed to change. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of damp earth from the orchard. A few dead leaves spiraled across the courtyard, brushing against Thomas's shoes before skittering past Grace, like old memories refusing to rest. Emily rose from her place beside Eleanor. Her voice held a softness that belied its courage. "Dr. Sullivan, would you walk with me? Just for a few minutes." Grace blinked, surprised but nodded. They stepped away from the crowd down a narrow stone path lined with dormant hydrangeas. When they reached a quiet bend, Emily stopped and looked at her with earnest eyes. "My fiancé's family is not easy," she began. "They carry their image like a shield. But I want you to know that Andrew is not his uncle. He is not the choices they made." Grace nodded slowly. "I can see that." Emily hesitated. "Whatever happens with the sealed documents, I hope you'll let us help repair what was broken. Maybe not with the past, but with what comes next." Grace felt something inside her loosen a small knot of tension she hadn't even known she carried. "I don't want to destroy this family," she said. "I only want them to stop pretending they built their life alone." Emily exhaled, relieved. Then maybe there's hope. Behind them, raised voices swelled, suddenly Evan shouting Thomas's name. Mark moving fast. Grace turned sharply. Thomas Hawthorne had disappeared from the courtyard, and everything inside Hawthorne Hill shifted again, tilting toward a danger none of them anticipated. Evan's shout cracked through the courtyard like a dropped glass. Chairs scraped. Guests jerked their heads toward the terrace. Mark Ellison's radio hissed as he pivoted sharply, scanning the grounds with the precision of a man who'd seen too many situations take a turn in the span of a heartbeat. The air thickened with alarm, the kind that comes when guilt walks off unchecked. Grace's breath caught. She rushed with Emily back toward the courtyard boots, striking the cobblestones in hurried rhythm. "Where did he go?" she demanded. But even before anyone answered, she knew. Thomas Hawthorne wasn't the type to stand still and accept collapse. Men like him didn't break quietly. They ran. Or worse, they tried to rewrite the ending. "He was just here," Evan stammered, pale with panic. He stood up, muttered something, And then, God, I turned. For 1 second, Mark raised a hand for silence, his jaw tight. He's still on the property. He wouldn't risk leaving the grounds with this many witnesses. Eleanor rose unsteadily, gripping the back of her chair. Thomas wouldn't run, she insisted, though her voice held no conviction. He wouldn't abandon us. Andrew shut his eyes. Mum, he already has. A chill moved across Grace's spine, not fear for herself, but for the truth she had spent decades trying to resurrect. If Thomas vanished, the narrative could twist again, slip from her hide in shadows, just as it had before. She could not let that happen. Not this time. Mark signaled the guards. Circle the orchard. Check the north slope and the service road. He can't have gone far. The guards hurried off, splitting into 2 directions. The wedding guests parted as they passed, whispering anxiously, their nerves jangling like wind chimes. Grace scanned the grounds. Hawthorne Hill was large, too large. The orchard stretched behind the house, a labyrinth of bare branches and uneven rows. The manor itself, with its narrow corridors and multiple stairwells, held enough hiding places to swallow a man determined to disappear. Emily touched Grace's arm gently. He might be frightened. Grace shook her head. Not frightened, cornered. Eleanor stiffened. Are you saying he's dangerous? I'm saying. Grace replied quietly that people who fear losing everything often make the worst decisions. Mark stepped closer, lowering his voice. Grace, did he ever threaten your family back then? A memory flickered, shoes crunching gravel, her mother's trembling hands, turning a lock, the weight of silence pressing against the door, while someone stood outside, long past dusk. She inhaled, indirectly. That was enough for Mark. He tapped his radio again. Initiate a precautionary search. Treat him as emotionally volatile. Eleanor's hand flew to her chest. Precautionary, Mark. He's my brother-in-law. He wouldn't hurt anyone. Mark looked at her with a gentleness that held no comfort. People under pressure don't always act like themselves. Andrew stepped in. We should split up. He wouldn't hide from me. But Grace placed a steady hand on his arm. Don't follow him alone. Their eyes met, and Andrew understood. The betrayal had changed his uncle into someone unrecognizable. They moved in groups. Grace and Andrew headed toward the orchard with Emily and Harold trailing behind. Evan and Eleanor moved toward the manor's east wing. Mark and 2 guards circled the perimeter. The orchard swallowed sound. The branches clawed at the grey sky. A cold hush settled beneath the trees, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. Thomas Andrew called. Just talk to us, please. No answer. Grace scanned the rows, heart tightening. Look for broken branches, footprints, anything disturbed. Harold pointed shakily to a set of tracks leading toward an old shed near the northern edge. He might have gone there. That place has always been. He hesitated. Well, it was where your father kept tools and documents, Dr. Sullivan. Grace froze. The shed. A childhood memory flashed her father's large hands, closing a heavy wooden door. His voice soft when he said, Some things stay here, Gracie. Some things we don't take with us. She stepped forward, pulse escalating. Andrew, stay behind me. Andrew hesitated, then nodded. They approached the shed slowly. The door stood ajar, creaking slightly against the wind. Inside the dim space smelled of old wood oil and the faint residue of apples, long since harvested. Thomas Grace called, voice steady but low. A sound stirred in the shadows, a rustle, then a muffled clatter. Andrew tensed. Mark's voice shouted from behind as he jogged toward them. Stop, don't go in alone. But Grace had already pushed the door wide. Thomas Hawthorne stood at the far end of the shed, half hidden behind a workbench. His suit jacket was rumpled, his eyes feverish with a mix of anger and terror. He held a dusty cardboard box in his hands, its lid askew. The moment he saw Grace, he froze. "Put the box down," Mark ordered, stepping inside behind her. Thomas clutched it tighter. "You don't understand. This is all I have left." Grace took a cautious step closer. "What's in the box?" Thomas swallowed hard. "Proof, notes, correspondence, things your father wrote during the dispute, things that could destroy everything." Andrew's voice cracked. "Why would you take those?" Thomas ignored him. His gaze stayed locked on Grace. "If these come out, every deal I made after acquiring this place will crumble. Donations, partnerships, the trust your father lost. If anyone sees the compromises I made, the whole family collapses." "Your story buries us." Grace's heart pounded. "Thomas, those are my father's documents. They belong to me." "No," he whispered. "Not anymore. If they surface, I lose everything. Everything I sacrificed for." Mark stepped closer, hand hovering near his belt. "Sir, I need you to hand over the box." Thomas's voice suddenly cracked with a sound that was almost a sob. "If I give this up, decades of my life turn to ash. Don't you get it? I'm not the only one who falls. The board, the town council, the foundation, everything I touched becomes suspect." Emily spoke softly. "That was your choice." Thomas shook his head violently. No, it was the only way." Grace moved nearer, still her voice a quiet tether. "Thomas, what if there's something inside that clears my father's name? Aren't you tired? Tired of holding a truth that doesn't belong to you?" Thomas's breath stuttered. He looked down at the box. Mark made a subtle hand motion, signaling the guards to flank the shed's entrance. Thomas noticed. Panic surged in his eyes. "No," he shouted, staggering back. "You can't take this from me." Grace reached out instinctively. "Thomas." But his heel struck the uneven wooden floorboard that had always creaked, the same board Grace remembered tripping over at age 8. Thomas lost his balance. The box slipped from his hands. Papers spilled into the air like shattered feathers. Old letters, receipts, unfiled affidavits, a photograph of a little girl in a blue coat standing in the orchard beside her father. Grace's photograph. Thomas lunged, but Mark caught him by the elbow, restrained him cleanly, professionally, without unnecessary force. The guard secured the area gathering the scattered documents. Grace knelt on the floor, fingers trembling, lifting the photograph into the dim light. She touched the worn edges as though the image might dissolve. Andrew stood beside her. "Grace." "I'm so sorry." She didn't answer. Her chest tightened, not with anger now, but something far heavier, recognition. Thomas slumped against the wall as Mark cuffed him gently. He didn't fight. The fury had drained out of him, leaving only exhaustion. His eyes lifted to Grace. "I never meant to hurt you." Grace rose, slowly holding the photograph. "Intentions don't erase consequences." He bowed his head. Mark nodded to her. "These documents will be logged, reviewed, and protected. They're evidence now." Grace stepped out of the shed, the cold air biting her cheeks. Behind her, the orchard rustled softly. Ahead of her, the manor loomed. And for the first time, she understood exactly how deep the roots of this story went, and how much farther she would have to walk before the truth stood clear in the open light. The walk back from the orchard felt longer than the journey out, as if Hawthorne Hill had expanded in the 20 minutes Grace had spent inside the shed, reliving a childhood she never meant to confront again. Emily stayed close beside her, offering quiet presence rather than words. Andrew trailed a few steps behind, his posture slumped under the weight of what his family had become in one afternoon. Mark Ellison followed last, carrying the box of documents against his chest with the reverence of someone holding a fragile truth. When they emerged into the courtyard again, the guests parted instinctively, creating a corridor of uneasy eyes and murmured speculation. The whispers had changed since Thomas fled, no longer fueled by curiosity, but by something raw, guilt recognition, fear of their own silence. People had known the Hawthorne legacy was polished to a shine. Few had questioned what lay beneath the lacquer. Eleanor stood at the center of the gathering arms, wrapped around herself, as if she could hold her world together by sheer force. She looked smaller than before, humbled not by humiliation, but by clarity. Her gaze went straight to the box in Mark's arms, then to her son, then to Grace. "Is he?" she asked quietly. Mark nodded. "We have him sitting inside with a guard. Not under arrest, but he's not leaving the property." Eleanor exhaled relief, and dread tangled in her breath. "Good." Grace stepped forward, stopping a few feet from her. The afternoon light had shifted lower, casting long shadows across the flagstones, elongating every figure, as if stretching the truth into shapes no one could ignore. Eleanor's voice trembled. "What did he take?" Grace lifted the photograph, still clutched in her hand. "Pieces of my past." She paused, and evidence of his involvement in the dispute. Eleanor flinched. "I truly didn't know. I believe you," Grace said. The simple acknowledgement made Eleanor's eyes well with restrained emotion. She blinked quickly, unwilling to let tears betray her in front of the guests. It wasn't pride now, just years of suppressing everything that might reveal the vulnerability beneath her carefully curated composure. Andrew joined them, standing between the two women, as though anchoring a fragile bridge. "Grace," he said softly, "we want to help, however we can." Before she could answer, a frantic voice cut across the courtyard. "Has anyone seen my father?" Everyone turned as Andrew's younger sister, Lauren Hawthorne, hurried from the manor. Her heels clicked against the stone in uneven rhythm, her hair slightly disheveled, her expression etched with panic. Eleanor's breath hitched. "Lauren, what are you doing here?" "You weren't supposed to arrive until tomorrow." Lauren shook her head quickly. "I got an alert from the Foundation's attorney. Something about sealed property records and a conflict of interest inquiry involving Uncle Thomas." Her face paled further when she noticed the tension in everyone's posture. "What happened?" Eleanor closed her eyes, as if bracing for impact. "Your uncle has been keeping secrets." Lauren stared at her mother, then at Grace, then at Mark, holding the evidence box. Her breath wavered. This is about the estate, isn't it?" "The rumors Dad mentioned years ago." Grace looked at her steadily. "They weren't rumors." Lauren pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "Oh my God." Eleanor moved toward her daughter, placing a hand on her arm. "We're dealing with it now, Lauren. Everything is coming to light." But Lauren stepped back, shaking her head. "Coming to light, Mum. The Foundation, our entire philanthropic arm, depends on the reputation of this family. Donors have already been skittish. If word gets out that the property itself was acquired through deception—" "Enough," Andrew said sharply. "This isn't about donors or reputations. It's about what we did to her family." Lauren snapped her gaze toward him, stunned. "You're defending her. She's the one who lived through the fallout," Andrew replied. "Not us." Grace listened quietly, feeling the ache of her own memories, but also something new. The recognition that the Hawthorne children, unlike the generation before them, were not blind to the cost of truth. Eleanor's voice softened. Lauren, whatever consequences follow, will face them. Lauren's eyes glistened with fear and resentment. You don't understand, Mum. If the foundation collapses, hundreds of people lose support, patients, families, communities. This isn't just about us. Grace inhaled slowly. You're not wrong. The ripples of truth spread far. Lauren looked at her desperately. Then why now? Why, after all these years? Couldn't you have stayed silent? Grace asked quietly. Pretended this land never belonged to my family. Pretended my father wasn't broken by a lie he didn't create. Lauren's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. I wish this had come out differently. Grace didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was steady, but not sharp. I wish that too. A soft rustling of footsteps drew their attention as Harold Green approached, hat in hand. His shoulders bowed slightly, the weight of years carried openly now. Dr. Sullivan, he said gently, your father kept more than just papers in that shed. There were things he meant to show you when you were older. Grace felt her throat tighten. What things? Harold hesitated, glancing toward the manor. Journals, notes about this property, drawings your mother made. Something he called the Orchard Promise. Grace blinked. The Orchard Promise. Harold nodded. Your parents believed the land wasn't just an inheritance. It was a responsibility. They meant to restore it, protect it, pass it to you one day. His voice faltered. He never got the chance. Something warm and painful and profound unfurled inside Grace, a memory rising from the depths, like a breath she'd forgotten how to take. She could almost feel her father, lifting her onto his shoulders beneath the summer canopy, telling her someday, this will all be yours, Gracie. Not because you own it, but because you understand it. She swallowed hard. Those journals, they're still here. Harold nodded. Hidden under the floorboards in the far corner. I didn't dare touch them. Mark frowned slightly. We'll have to log them as evidence once they're recovered. Grace nodded. She understood, but the thought of reading her father's words after 30 years struck her with dizzying force, a future she couldn't have imagined when she first stepped onto the property hours ago. Lauren crossed her arms tightly across her chest. So what happens now? We wait for a judge to unseal the records. We watch our entire family legacy implode. Eleanor placed a firm hand on her daughter's shoulder. No, we confront what we've ignored for too long. Andrew nodded. It's time we faced what really happened. Emily added softly. Legacy built on truth is stronger than legacy built on silence. Grace looked at each of them, the mother struggling to reconcile pride with reality, the son seeking integrity, the daughter terrified of collapse, the fiancé hoping for renewal. A family caught at the crossroads of who they had been and who they might yet become. She drew a steady breath. This won't be easy for any of us, but the truth is no longer buried, and once the past is acknowledged, the future has a chance to be honest. Eleanor straightened slowly, the tremor in her hands fading as resolve took its place. Grace, she said, when those documents are unsealed, I want to be there. I want to hear every word. Grace nodded. You will. A distant rumble of thunder rolled over the valley, soft but warning. The storm was not yet overhead, but it was coming a fitting echo of the reckoning unfolding at Hawthorne Hill. Lauren wiped her eyes, trying to hold herself together, and Uncle Thomas Mark answered gently. He'll remain here until we determine next steps. Grace turned toward the manor, watching the darkening windows of her childhood wing reflect the thickening clouds. Somewhere inside, Thomas was sitting in a room with a guard surrounded, not by legal threats, but by the collapse of his own choices. She exhaled slowly. The past had finally returned. But what came next, reconciliation or ruin, would depend on the courage each of them could find in the storm that waited just beyond the orchard. The storm broke sooner than anyone expected. A low clap of thunder rolled across the valley as the first drops of rain splattered against the flagstones. Guests hurried beneath the reception tent, clutching their coats and murmuring anxiously, eager to escape the cold that suddenly seeped through the air like a warning. But Grace remained where she stood, near the orchard path, her eyes fixed on the darkening silhouette of Hawthorne Hill. The manor looked older under the shifting sky, its stone walls weathered windows, reflecting a truth that had been ignored for too long. Mark Ellison approached her, the evidence box still tucked carefully beneath his arm. "We need to get these inside before the rain ruins something," he said quietly. Grace nodded, though her body felt reluctant to move. She had lived 30 years with the weight of what happened, and now the truth was finally spread out before her fragile, real demanding attention. It was strange how grief didn't arrive all at once, but in waves that came when the world least expected them. Andrew jogged towards them, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned hair dampening in the drizzle. "We set up a room in the West Hall," he said. "Dry private. Mum wants to go through the papers with you as soon as we can." Grace studied him for a moment. His sincerity was unmistakable, and it struck her with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply. Inside the manor, tension clung to the air. The West Hall had once been the domain of her mother. Sketches pinned to corkboards, jars of brushes lined neatly along the windowsill. Now the room had become a makeshift archive, its long oak table cleared for the documents Mark carried. Eleanor paced near the window, her fingers twisting in the sleeves of her coat. Lauren sat stiffly in an armchair, scanning her phone with restless hands, no doubt bracing for fallout, already rippling through the Foundation's network. Grace entered last, her steps slow, as if the house itself resisted releasing her from the past. Eleanor's eyes met hers instantly. "Before we start," she said, voice trembling, "I want to apologize for the way I treated you when you arrived today." She took a small breath. "I was blind, and rude, and wrong." Grace absorbed the words quietly. They landed not as an absolution, but as an opening. "Thank you," she said. "But an apology only matters if it leads somewhere." Eleanor nodded. "I intend for it to." Mark placed the box on the table and began laying out the documents. The room filled with the soft rustle of papers, the muted thump of folders being opened. Some pages were yellowed with age, others crisp untouched since the day they'd been sealed. At the bottom of the box, Mark found several envelopes, wrapped in a rubber band, handwritten, faded. Grace inhaled sharply. "My father's handwriting." Lauren leaned forward. "Are those part of the legal file?" "No," Mark said. "These weren't logged. They were kept separate." Grace reached for them with trembling fingers. The top envelope bore her name, Gracie, in her father's looping script. Her throat tightened. "He must have written these before we left." Eleanor's expression softened. "Take your time." But Grace shook her head. "No, this isn't just about me. Not anymore." She slid her thumb beneath the flap and opened the first letter. "My dearest Gracie, if you are reading this, it means life carried us farther from Hawthorne Hill than I ever imagined. I want you to know the truth, not the version others will try to tell." Grace closed her eyes briefly before reading on. "This land was given to our family, with the promise we would protect it. Not for wealth, not for pride, but because it needs caretakers who listen to it. Her voice faltered. She handed the letter to Eleanor, who accepted it with trembling hands. Andrew frowned thoughtfully. Caretakers. What did he mean by that? Grace moved to the window, staring out at the orchard obscured by rain. My father believed the land had value beyond money. He used to say the soil remembers kindness. She shook her head. I didn't understand it then. Evan entered the room at that moment, rain streaking his glasses. The judge approved the expedited request, he said, breathlessly. The sealed records will be delivered electronically within the hour. Lauren jumped to her feet. What that fast? They must have been flagged before Evan replied. Someone was monitoring them. Grace's stomach tightened. She had a feeling she knew who. Eleanor clasped her hands. Then let's finish reviewing what we have. They unfolded the next documents, affidavits, real estate assessments, old correspondence between attorneys. One affidavit bore a signature that made Eleanor pale. This is my husband's, Mark read aloud. He signed a statement asserting there were no competing claims on the estate. Eleanor shook her head in disbelief. But he didn't know. Thomas kept the Sullivan dispute from him. Grace braced herself. Not entirely. All eyes turned to her. My father spoke to someone named Hawthorne on the phone, she said slowly. I overheard. But he didn't say which one. Lauren sank back into her chair. So Dad might have known something wasn't right. Or, he suspected, Grace replied. He might have trusted Thomas to handle it. Trusted the wrong man. Evan swallowed hard as he examined a separate document, a ledger. Here's something else, he said. A series of payments from an unknown account to the original trustee who managed the Sullivan property. Mark looked over his shoulder. Bribes likely, Evan whispered. Eleanor's voice broke. Thomas. Grace felt anger flare hot through her chest, not wild, but focused, the kind that brought clarity rather than chaos. This proves he orchestrated everything, and he did it while letting my father believe he failed. Andrew slammed a hand against the table, rattling the glass lamp. He lied to all of us. He let us build our lives on a foundation he knew was poisoned. Eleanor pressed her hands to her forehead. My God, the years lost the harm done. Grace looked at her, a strange mix of sympathy and distance settling between them. You may not have known the truth, she said quietly, but you benefited from it. Eleanor lowered her hands and met Grace's eyes. I know. And I will not hide behind ignorance. A notification chimed from Evan's tablet. He opened the email, quickly scanning. They're here. The unsealed documents. He projected them onto the large monitor on the wall. The first file opened with a soft, digital click, the original evidence submission from Sullivan versus Hawthorne trustee, 1993. There, in a grainy scan, was the forged notice, and beneath it, the original handwritten note from the trustee, admitting coercion. Lauren covered her mouth. Eleanor whispered, God help us. And Grace, staring at the words that had altered the course of her childhood, felt her knees weaken. Her father had been right. He had been telling the truth all along. Mark's voice came quietly from behind her. Grace, this clears your family entirely. A tear slipped down her cheek, not from sorrow, but from the relief of finally being believed. Andrew moved around the table and placed a hand on her shoulder. You deserve justice, he said softly, and our family deserves the truth. Grace turned to face them all. This isn't about punishment or reclaiming land. It's about restoring what was taken, my father's honor, my family's story. Eleanor nodded. "Tell us what you need." Grace exhaled deeply. For the first time since stepping onto Hawthorne Hill, she felt the ground beneath her shift toward something steadier, not the restoration of the past, but the building of something new. "I'll tell you," she said. "But first we need to face Thomas." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the orchard in a stark, ghostly glow. And somewhere deep in the manor, a door slammed. Thomas Hawthorne had heard the truth, and he knew time was running out. Thunder cracked again, closer this time, rattling the window panes of the West Hall as Grace led the group through the corridor toward the room where Thomas was being held. The manor's long, dim hallway stretched before them, lined with portraits of Hawthorne ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow their procession with solemn judgment. The polished floor reflected flashes of lightning, turning each step into a ghostly flicker. Grace felt the house tightening around her, not in fear but in recognition, as if the past itself was walking beside her. Near the end of the hall, Mark Ellison stood guard outside a small study. His posture stiffened when he saw the group approach. "He's inside," he said. "Still cooperative for now." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice quiet but resolute. "I need to speak to him." Mark nodded and opened the door. Thomas sat, hunched at the edge of a leather chair, elbows on his knees, fingers knitted tightly as though holding himself together. Rain battered the windows behind him, the storm a restless drumbeat to the silence, saturating the room. He didn't look up when they entered. His gaze stayed locked on the floor, as if he hoped the truth might sink through the wood and vanish beneath the foundation. Eleanor closed the door behind her. "Thomas?" He didn't answer. Grace stepped beside Mark, every movement controlled. She felt no anger now, only the steady momentum of justice taking shape. Eleanor moved toward her brother-in-law, not with fury, but with heartbreak. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me walk through this house, believing we belonged here, without question?" Thomas finally looked up. His eyes were hollow, ringed with the exhaustion of a man who had spent decades hiding from his own conscience. "Because if you'd known," he whispered, "you would have insisted we give it back. And I couldn't watch the family fall apart again." "We didn't fall apart," Eleanor replied. "You tore us away from the truth. That's not protection. That's betrayal." Andrew stepped forward, jaw tight. "How long did you plan to hide what you did? Forever?" Thomas let out a long, shaking breath. "I thought once the property stabilized, once the debts were paid, once we rebuilt the orchard, I thought the truth wouldn't matter anymore." Grace felt something inside her shift, a slow, sharp recoil from words she'd heard too many times in too many forms. "The truth always matters," she said quietly. Thomas's eyes darted to her, filled with the desperation of someone seeking absolution he knew he didn't deserve. "Grace, I can't undo what happened. I can't give your father back his life or rewrite the fear you lived through. I can't fix what drove you away. But please don't destroy what's left of this family. Your justice will wipe us out." Grace inhaled, letting his plea settle into the air without softening her resolve. 3 decades ago, you told yourself a lie that my suffering was the price of your convenience, that my father's legacy was an acceptable sacrifice. You convinced yourself that survival justified cruelty. She stepped closer, her voice steadier than the storm outside. "But justice isn't destruction. It's recognition." Thomas shook his head, tears forming now. "Recognition won't save us." No Grace replied, but honesty might. Eleanor placed a trembling hand on the table. "Thomas, you will accept responsibility. Publicly. You will testify to everything you did, every coercion, every forged document, every payment." Thomas recoiled. "Eleanor, you owe this family the truth," she said. "And you owe Grace something far more than that." Lauren stepped forward, wiping her eyes but holding Thomas's gaze with surprising steel. "Uncle Thomas, the Foundation can only survive if we lead with transparency. If we hide this, we lose credibility forever. If we reveal it truthfully, we rebuild with integrity." Thomas let out a broken laugh. "Integrity? Do you think the public cares about integrity? They care about scandal. They care about blood." Emily, who had remained silent until now, spoke with quiet conviction. "Maybe. But they also care about courage, and this family has a chance to show courage for the first time in decades." Grace watched them, absorbing the emotional collision unfolding before her. She had imagined this moment countless times, every variation ending with punishment, blame, a dramatic severing of ties. But standing here, listening to the Hawthorne children defend accountability rather than tradition, she felt something she hadn't expected the possibility of healing. Andrew turned to Grace, his voice steady. "When the documents are filed, I'll ask the board to step down until the investigation is complete." Mum supports that decision. Lauren does too. We'll restructure the foundation afterward if it survives. Grace nodded slowly. If it survives, it will be because it finally stands on truth. Thomas lowered his head to his hands, shoulders shaking. The weight of the room bore down on him, the truth, the consequences, the eyes of every person he'd failed. After a long moment, he whispered hoarsely, "What do you want me to say?" Eleanor stepped closer, her expression aching and resolute. "The truth, all of it. Every word you hid for 30 years. Mark added quietly, "It will go better for you if you cooperate fully." Grace approached him last. Her voice softened, but not with sympathy, with clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "You will admit what you did. You will help restore my father's name. And you will support the Hawthorns as they confront their own part in the legacy you manipulated." Thomas raised his head slowly. Tears streaked his cheeks. And then Grace paused. "Then the law takes its course, and so does time." He nodded, broken and resigned. "I'll give my statement." Eleanor closed her eyes, relief and sorrow entwined. Andrew squeezed Emily's hand. Lauren whispered something that sounded like thank you to no one in particular. Grace turned away from Thomas, her breath steady, her pulse calm. The truth was finally breathing again, freed from the shadows where it had been forced to hide. She moved toward the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, she looked out at the orchard, her father's orchard, its trees bowing under the dark sky. She imagined him there, laughing in the sunlight, teaching her the names of flowers, the meaning of patience, the shape of honor. For the first time in 30 years, she felt him close. She rested a hand on the cool glass. "This house knows the truth now," she murmured. "And so does everyone else." Mark approached her quietly. "Grace, when you give your final statement, what do you plan to ask for?" Grace turned, her expression clear and strong. "A memorial in the orchard, a public acknowledgement of what happened, a permanent scholarship fund in my father's name, and the restoration of the orchard promise." Eleanor's voice trembled from across the room. "You'll have all of it." Grace nodded, accepting not victory, but justice. A different kind of inheritance. As the storm eased and the house settled into a deeper quiet, Grace stepped toward the door. She felt the weight of the moment in her bones, a closing chapter that made room for something new. In the hallway outside, the lights glowed warm against the darkening sky, guiding her like lanterns marking the way forward. She paused, looking back at the family gathered in the study. Do better with the truth than you did with the lie. Andrew nodded firmly. Lauren exhaled softly. Eleanor pressed a hand to her heart. Thomas bowed his head, and Grace turned, walking toward a future she had made possible through courage, persistence, and the insistence that hidden stories deserved to be told. If this journey moved, you take a moment to subscribe, and share your thoughts with the words, "Truth stands forever."